Hello dear chess fans, my name is Eugene Grinis. Welcome to my free chess school from beginners to advanced, open for everyone who want to improve own game. This video is intended for the beginners. The third world champion, Capablanca, wrote in his book Chess Fundamentals about bishops and knights. Although the knight is generally considered to be on a par with the bishop in strength, the latter piece is somewhat stronger in the majority of cases, in which they are opposed to each other. For all general theoretical purposes, the bishop and knight have to be considered as the same value, though it is my opinion that the bishop will prove the more valuable piece in most cases. And it is well known that two bishops are almost always better than two knights. The bishop will be stronger against pawns than the knight, and in combination with pawns will also be stronger against the rook than the knight will be. A bishop and a rook are also stronger than a knight and a rook, but a queen and a knight may be stronger than a queen and the bishop. A bishop will often be worth more than 3 pawns, but a knight very seldom so, and may even not be worth so much. A rook will be worth a knight and 2 pawns, or a bishop and 2 pawns, but as said before, the bishop will be a better piece against the rook. It is generally thought by amateurs that the knight is the more valuable piece of the two. The chief reason being that, unlike the bishop, the knight can command both black and white squares. However, the fact is generally overlooked that the knight at any one time has the choice of one color only. It takes much longer to bring a knight from one wing to the other. The weaker the player, the more terrible the knight is to him. But as a player increases in strength, the value of the bishop becomes more evident to him. And of course there is, or should be, a corresponding decrease in his estimation of the value of the knight as compared to the bishop. This and much more can be found on my webpage, Chess Quotations. One reason that bishops are worth slightly more than knights is that the bishop can dominate a knight on the open board. Let's take a look on this position. White plays bishop g4. The white bishop on g4 controls all 3 of the squares to which the black knight on g1 can move. It is a well-known pattern. Bishops 3 squares away from enemy knights can dominate them just as they do it in this position. Black's king has to move. king b8, a4, king a8, a5, king b8, a6, king a8, a7. Now black's king has no move, and black has to move the knight. Knight e2. Now bishop takes on e2 would be a huge mistake, because it would be a stalemate. Let's go back. After knight e2, white plays bishop f3, checkmate. In many ways, the bishop is the knight's opposite. Whereas the knight moves slowly, the bishop zooms across the board. So the bishop doesn't care too much about getting right up next to the action, since it can influence things from far away. But unlike the knight, who hops over pieces, the bishop can be blocked. So the bishop cares very much about its diagonals, being clear of pieces or pawns. Let's take a look on this position. Even though white's bishop on g2 is away from the action, it is extremely powerful, because it controls a long diagonal, along which it attacks black's pawn on c6. Notice how badly black's knight on g6 is placed, because it is forced to defend the pawn on e5, and because it is controlled by the white pawn on g3. Black's bishop on d7, on the other hand, is very passive, as it is forced to defend the c6 pawn. White's fianchettoed bishop on g2 is much more powerful, because it attacks a weakness, whereas black's bishop must defend the same weakness. Fianchetto is Italian for on the flank. In chess, a fianchetto is a special formation of pawns that gives the bishop an opportunity to take control over the longest diagonal on the chessboard. White can fianchetto the bishop on the queen side by playing b2, b3, and then bishop c1 to b2. On the king side, white can play g2, g3, and then bishop f1 to g2. Many players enjoy these formations because fianchettoed bishops have such sweeping control through the board. The game continues. Bishop b4. White carries out a skewer, It attacks the black queen, and when the queen moves, white can capture the rook on f8 with the bishop. Skewers are dramatic attacks by the bishop, usually involving a check that often net a rook or a queen. c5 to avoid the skewer, but bishop g2 takes the rook on a8. Pawn takes bishop on b4, bishop to g2, white is winning. Bishops are best in open positions, where pawns don't block their diagonals. As a position opens up, for instance, the center pawns get traded, it becomes more and more likely that bishops will be valued more highly than knights. Those wide open diagonals allow the bishops to reach their full potential. Open diagonals are of no less importance for the bishops than open files for the rooks. While knights have to get close to their victims in order to hit them with a deadly blow, bishops have true long-range power. Let's take a look on this position. White has two very strong bishops and plays queen d4, threatening the mate on a7. If now bishop d7, then follows queen a7 check, king c8, queen a8 checkmate. Let's go back to the game. Black plays b6. Queen e4, threatening mate on a8. c6, bishop takes pawn on b6, and white is actually winning after bishop b7, rook a to d1. The bishop is forever committed to traveling on the same color. To make sure that the bishop will have the most substantial effect on the position, it is important not to fix your pawns on the color of your bishop. Just as there are good rooks on open files and good knights on the center where the enemy pawns can't attack them, there are good bishops and bad bishops. From experience, it is clear that bishops are good as long as you don't limit their mobility behind pawns that are fixed, set on the same color as the bishop. The most important trait of the bishop is its long range. A bad bishop is a bishop whose mobility is restricted by its own pawns, and a good bishop is a bishop whose mobility is not restricted by its own pawns. As the name suggests, you should avoid the bad bishop and aim for the good bishop. You should not put too many pawns on the same color square as your bishop, as this will tend to make your bishop bad. The term bad bishop means that your bishop is situated on the same color as your center pawns, which block it and limit its activity. If you have such a bishop, you usually want to do one of three things. 1. Trade it for a piece of equal value. 2. Get the pawns of the color of your bishop. 3. Get the bishop outside the pawn chain. Then it will be active. As early as in the 18th century, Philidor taught that one should place his pawns on the squares opposite to the color of his bishop. If the bishop is stuck behind its pawns, it is called bad. The bishops are inspired by open diagonals. Whenever you see a bishop sitting on an open diagonal, watch out. The very first move may be fatal. Let's take a look on this position. Here white's bishop on d3 is good, while black's bishop on d7 is bad. Black's bishop is blocked by its own pawns and is therefore terribly passive. White's bishop, on the other hand, is very active, as it is perfectly centralized and controls many squares on both the king side and the queen side. The game continues. Bishop takes pawn on h7 check. Such a combination, bishop sack on h7, is known in chess as a Greek sacrifice. King takes bishop on h7. Knight g5 check, opening the way for the queen to the king side. If now king g8, then follows queen h5, threatening mate on h7. Rook e8, making room on f8 for the king. Queen takes pawn on f7 check. King h8, the only move. Rook e3, threatening rook to h3 mate. Knight f5 in order to protect the king. Rook h3 check. Knight h6, the only move. And now follows the rook sacrifice. Rook takes knight on h6 check. The rook has to be taken. Queen h8, checkmate. Let's go back to the game. Knight g5, check. Black plays king g6, attacking the knight. Queen g4, threatening a discovery attack with knight takes pawn on e6 check, winning the queen. f5, attacking the queen. Pawn takes the f5 pawn and passant. Queen takes pawn on f6. Knight takes pawn on e6, attacking the queen. The knight has to be taken. Queen takes bishop on e6 check. King g5, the only move. h4 check. If now king to f4, then queen e5 check. King g4, the only move. And now queen g5, checkmate. Let's go back to h4 check. If now king h5, then rook e5 check. King takes pawn on h4, and now g3 checkmate, or queen h3 mate. Let's go back to the game. Black takes the pawn on h4 with the king. Rook to e5, threatening g3 mate, and also queen h3 mate. Rook f5, rook takes rook on f5, knight takes rook, queen takes knight on f5, threatening g3 mate. Queen g5, and now queen h3 checkmate. As a rule, a bishop is stronger than a knight in open positions when the events unfold on both sides that allow to reveal bishop's long-ranged features. In the endgame too, when position is open and the struggle evolves on both sides. The bishop is stronger. In open positions with pawns on both flanks, bishops are generally superior to knights due to their ability quickly shift their attention from one side of the board to the other, and even sometimes influence both sides simultaneously. As a long-range piece, the bishop is stronger than knight in positions with passed pawns. This position is open with pawns on both sides of the board. Although each player has the same number of pawns, to have a bishop here is a decided advantage, since not only there are pawns on both sides, but there are passed pawns. H pawn for white, A pawn for black. Black should have extreme difficulty in drawing this position, if he can do it at all. A proper play in these endings, as in all similar endings, is advance the king to the center of the board or towards the passed pawns, and rapid advance of the passed pawns as far as is consistent with their safety. Now let's take a look on the fight between the bishop and the knight in the endgame. The game continues. King e2, knight f6, king f3, b5, g4, a5, h4, b4, g5, attacking the knight, knight d7, h5, king e7, king e4, a4, king d5, a3, king c4. If now a2, then follows bishop b2, stopping the a pawn, white is probably winning. Let's go back to the game. King c4, black plays c5, king b3, knight e5, bishop e3, c4 check. Now, a huge mistake would be to take the b4 pawn with the king. a2, and black is winning after bishop d4, knight c6 check, a knight fork. Let's go back to the game. c4 check, white plays king a2, knight f3, bishop c5 check, the bishop fork, king e6, bishop takes pawn on b4, knight takes pawn on g5, king takes pawn on a3. Now white has an extra pawn. King f5, bishop d2, attacking the knight, knight f3, attacking the bishop, bishop e3, knight e1, attacking the pawn on c2, king b2, defending the c pawn, knight g2, king c3, attacking the c4 pawn, knight e1, attacking the c2 pawn, f4, king f6, bishop d4 check, king f5, attacking the f4 pawn, bishop e5, defending the pawn, f6, attacking the bishop, bishop c7, king e6, h6, king f7, f5, king g8, bishop g3, attacking the knight, knight g2, bishop f2. The bishop is dominating the knight, king h7, king takes pawn on c4, king takes pawn on h6, king d4, king g5, attacking the f5 pawn, king e4, defending the pawn, if now knight f4, then follows bishop e3, pinning the knight to the king and winning the game. Let's go back to the game. King e4, black plays king g4, c4, knight f4, c5, knight h5, where is this knight going to? Can it stop the passed pawn? c6, knight g7. If now c7, then follows knight e8, attacking the c7 pawn, and after queening follows knight d6 check, attacking the king and the new queen. The knight fork. King d5, knight takes queen on c8 with a draw after king e6, attacking the f6 pawn, knight e7, the knight sack, king takes knight on e7, king takes the last white pawn on f5, and it is a draw. Let's go back to the game. Knight g7, white plays bishop d4, attacking the f6 pawn, the best move. Knight e8, defending the f6 pawn. And now follows bishop takes pawn on f6, the bishop sack. Knight takes bishop on f6 with check. King d4, knight e8, f6. Knight can't stop two passed pawns on f6 and c6. Knight takes pawn on f6, c7. White is queening and is winning the game. As we know, a bishop's weakness is that it is stuck on the color complex of squares, on one color complex of squares. However, this is not a factor if a player owns two bishops. Two bishops working together are a very powerful force, because they have all the long-range power of bishop and also control both colored diagonals. Often, the bishop's power is felt more strongly in the middle game or endgame, when it joins forces with its companion bishop. It is not always an advantage to be the only player with both bishops, but it often is. Some people go so far as to say that having both bishops is worth an extra half pawn. You should remember that everything depends on the position. Even blocked positions may open up, so one must never underestimate the potential of the two bishops. If you have two bishops, take note of that fact and try to open up the position. If you own the bishop pair and they are already active, or the position is already open, then you must concentrate on limiting the range of the enemy knight. A pair of bishops fighting against two knights, or a bishop and a knight, is a powerful weapon in open positions. If you have a bishop pair, you should strive to open up the game. The first world champion, William Steinitz, is commonly credited with the discovery that two bishops versus a bishop and knight, or two knights, is often an advantage. His play did much to codify the technical exploitation of the two bishops in open and semi-open positions. The very term, the advantage of the two bishops, or simple, the two bishops, quickly passed into the language of chess players. The stronger side advances his pawns along entire front, restricting the mobility of opponents' minor pieces. As a rule, the owner of a bishop pair should keep them from being exchanged. Let's take a look on the fight between two bishops and two knights in the end game. The game continues. King g6, attacking the knight on h7. The usual superiority of two bishops over two knights is logical. Two bishops work together very well, while two knights tend to run into each other and are much harder to manage. Knight f6, bishop d6 check, the best move. King e8, the only move. Bishop f7 check, king d7, attacking the bishop. Bishop f4, knight e8. Now it's time to trade one bishop for the knight in order to win material. Bishop takes knight on e8 check. King takes bishop. White could take the pawn on g7 immediately, but he plays at first g4. King f8, defending the pawn on g7. Bishop e5, attacking the pawn. Knight c6, attacking the bishop. Bishop takes pawn on g7, check. King g8. King takes pawn on h6. White has two extra passed pawns. Knight b4, attacking the pawn on a2. Bishop c3, attacking the knight. Knight takes pawn on a2, but bishop also takes pawn on a5. knight c1, h4, knight d3, attacking the b2 pawn, bishop c3, defending the pawn, b4, attacking the bishop, bishop d4, knight f4, h5, knight e2, attacking the bishop, bishop e5, knight c1, king g6, knight d3, attacking the bishop, bishop g3, the best continuation, knight takes pawn on b2, h6, knight d3, h7, check, king h8, king h6, b3, g5. Bishops really are better than knights in pawn race situations. b2, g6, b1, queening, but g7, checkmate. Okay, that's the lesson for today from the Eugene Grinis Chess School. I hope it was useful and you enjoyed it. If so, push likes, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and leave comments. Goodbye.